her name is right there in the title, so it's clearly undoubtedly her story, and she's very much the focal point. And I would say it surprised me the degree to which she emerged that way. I mean, I had begun with a sort of vague general idea that I wanted to write about a particular situation in which a woman was confronted with this decision she has to make. Three Tibetan lamas have knocked at her door in Evansville, Indiana, and have informed her that her young son, Cliff, is the reincarnation of a prominent Tibetan Lama and that they'd like him to go live in a monastery in Nepal. So that was my starting place. Just this is a set of circumstances, a situation that felt like a rich vein to tap with a lot of possibility. And I set out with that in mind, but very quickly, Evelyn took over with some kind of internal insistence on the fact. So you might imagine with what I just described that this book would begin right off the bat with that knock on the door. That the lamas show up and that's page one. But in fact, no, for many, many pages prior to that, we learn about Evelyn. We learn who Evelyn is. We meet her at 3 years of age. We see her first conscious experience as a human being. We watch her grow up. We watch her become a teenager and become discontent and rebellious. And then we watch her set out on the road in the American West with nothing particular in mind, no destination, just hoping to find some answer to this general question she has about life. The status quo doesn't work for her, so she needs to find something else. And she wanders around for quite some time. And all of this happens prior to this knock on the door that I mentioned earlier. And so what that tells me is, Evelyn basically took over the book. Evelyn became the center of the book. It's not the young boy, it's not necessarily the plot. It's more, who is this person and why does she make the decision that she makes in the end? I don't outline. I have a very vague sense of where a story is going. And I feel much interested in the story when it's that way. I prefer to have unknowns. I prefer each day to come to my desk with questions about what will happen next. I've always felt that if I had an outline to follow, that I might become sort of bored, that I'm just sort of executing a plan, and that I wouldn't have the thrill of discovery on a day-to-day basis, which is how it feels for me. And I generally start with character. I might have a sort of general idea of plot, and I might have an idea of sort of my thematic interests. What is the theme? What is the central idea here? And what sort of structure in terms of plot might it fit in? But those have always seemed to me a little bit secondary to an engagement with the central character. And so I would say on a daily basis while I'm working and in this sort of pushing forward into the unknown mode and not having an outline or a sense of direction, that I'm very often asking myself the question about who is this person, and given who they are, what would they do? And sort of like that old saw, that character is fate. And so I've always felt that if I don't work that way, that if I try to sort of push the person into an outline, pre-formulated plot points, that I'm sort of not like honoring the character, that really I have to know them well enough to know what they would in fact do and trust that, so for me, character precedes plot and is all important. And in this book, you mentioned you have to feel a kind of love for your characters, and I agree with that. To some extent, you have to sort of identify with them, just like the reader. You want your reader to be sympathetic. You want them to root for the person. You want the reader to feel like, I hope things turn out well for this protagonist, and I have to feel the same way. I need to want things to turn out well. And I think readers are put off, and so am I, when there's a kind of uh, the person is flawless, unlike most human beings, or the person is so flawed that they're reprehensible. There's sort of a middle ground. You have to create a real person who has flaws, who's less than perfect, but who at their center, at their core, has something that readers can really like. And in the case of Evelyn, that's her insistence on answering this question, what does it mean to live the right way? She just will not accept anything other than answering that question in life. So for the first half or more of the book, you're going deeper and deeper into really two important characters' lives and getting to know them well, so that when this sort of initial plot point arrives, this knock on the door, you already have a strong sense of the people who are included in that situation. And so then at that point, you're right, an entirely sort of new energy arrives in the book because now you have a more conventional drama in which there's a question, the question being, well, what's she going to do? You know, like most people would probably say, well, no, thank you. The way that they might say to someone trying to sell them something at their front door, just, go away. This sounds insane. That's probably the answer easily 99 times out of 100. But Evelyn, being who she is and being open to the world the way we've seen, and being somebody who's on this kind of search and is very unconventional, says, hey, come on in to these three llamas, and is willing to hear more about it and does hear more about it. And but she doesn't make any commitment. She just says, okay, thanks for letting me know about this. Have a nice day. See you later. And then after they leave, she starts to consider it as a possibility. Certainly it's not automatic for her. There's a lot to think about. And she begins to, in her own way, sort of investigate this matter. And as she does, word gets out, first to the local newspaper, which just sort of leaps to the assumption that this is, little Buddha in Evansville, when in fact she hasn't even decided anything yet. And then that's picked up by a radio station in Indiana. And then the story is picked up by a talk show in New York that broadcasts nationally. And so you're right, this thing sort of evolves into a media charge. It has a media charge to it. And she's in the throes of that. That becomes part of her challenge as she thinks this through. But it also helps her because the questions that get asked along the way by these different, interviewers force her to formulate who she is and what she really thinks. So there's a sort of gain to it, even while it's a challenge, that I did know that in the end she was going to say yes to this. And she was going to say yes to this primarily as a parent, feeling that this was the best thing for her son. Now, most people wouldn't agree. But when she tells her family that that's the decision she's made, they immediately gaslight her and say that, you're just insane. This is mistreatment of your child. And, we vehemently disagree with you on this. And this is just part of a larger sort of mental illness that you've had your whole life of just not being able to, live a normal life. But from her point of view, normal life isn't really satisfying. Like it doesn't really address the major concerns that she has about being alive. And that being the case for herself, she's reluctant to sort of throw her child into it because she doesn't believe in it. She doesn't believe that the way our society and culture is constructed is really best for the well-being of her child. And she has to honor that in the end. Finally she has to choose her child. And being who she is, this is her choice, that her son should have a spiritual life. Sounds to her like the right thing. And she ultimately honors that feeling she has.